They laughed at him. Every single person at that auction laughed out loud when old Walter Boone raised his trembling hand and bid the last of his savings on a horse that couldn't even see. The animal standing in the auction pen that morning was a pitiful sight. A chestnut mare, thin as a fence rail, her ribs showing through her dull coat, and both her eyes clouded over a milky gray. Blind, completely blind. The auctioneer had practically been giving her away. Nobody wanted a horse that couldn't work, couldn't be ridden, couldn't do a single useful thing on a farm. She was one bid away from the slaughter truck when a shaky old voice called out from the back of the crowd, "I'll take her." The whole barn went quiet, and then it erupted in laughter. Men slapped their knees. Somebody hollered, "Walter, you old fool, what in the world are you going to do with a blind horse?" Another shouted, "Save your money, old man, that thing's already got one hoof in the grave." But Walter Boone didn't laugh. At 73 years old, Walter had spent his whole life on a small farm just outside the town of Maple Ridge, and he had learned a long time ago not to measure a living thing by what other people said it was worth. He walked down through that jeering crowd, counted out his crumpled bills to the auctioneer, and led that frightened, stumbling mare out into the daylight. And as he loaded her into his rickety old trailer, he leaned in close to her ear and whispered, "Don't you worry now. Nobody's ever going to call you useless again." Walter named her Clover. The first few weeks were hard. Clover was terrified of everything because in the dark world she lived in, everything was a surprise. She'd startle at a slamming door, spook at a gust of wind, walk straight into the fence posts she couldn't see. But Walter was patient in the way that only an old farmer can be patient. Every morning before the sun came up, he'd go out to the barn and he'd talk to her. Just talk. He'd tell her about the weather, about his late wife, about the way the mist settled in the low fields in October. And slowly, Clover learned the sound of his voice. She learned that when Walter was near, she was safe. He built her a world she could navigate without her eyes. He laid down different textures on the ground, gravel by the water trough, straw by her stall, smooth flat stones along the path to the pasture, so she could feel where she was through her hooves. He hung a little bell around his own neck, so that wherever Walter walked, Clover could follow the sound. Before long, that blind horse trailed him around the whole farm like a shadow, her nose almost touching his shoulder, trusting him to be her eyes. The people in town still shook their heads. "Waste of hay," they'd mutter. "Waste of a good man's time." Walter's own nephew came by one Sunday and gently suggested it might be kinder to just put the animal down. Walter poured the boy a cup of coffee, looked him square in the eye, and said, "Son, kindness isn't kind because it makes sense. It's kind because somebody needs it." And that was the end of that conversation. What none of them understood, what Walter himself didn't fully understand yet, was that a horse who loses her sight doesn't lose her other senses. She sharpens them. Clover could hear things a mile off. She could feel a change in the ground through her hooves before a man could feel anything at all. She could smell rain hours before the first cloud ever showed on the horizon. Living in darkness had made her the most alert creature on that entire farm, and one terrible night that would make all the difference in the world. It was late spring when the storm came. Now, folks in Maple Ridge were used to storms, but this one was different. It had been raining for 2 solid days up in the mountains, and the old earthen dam that held back the reservoir above the valley had been groaning under the pressure. Nobody was watching it. Nobody thought to. The whole town was asleep in their beds that night, unaware that the water was rising higher and higher against a wall of dirt that was about to give way. But out in Walter's barn, Clover was awake, and she was afraid. Walter woke to the sound of her screaming, not a whinny, a scream, high and frantic, and the heavy thud of her body slamming against the stall door over and over again. He threw on his boots and ran out into the driving rain, and he found Clover in a state of pure panic, kicking, tossing her head, straining towards the door. Any other man might have tried to calm her down and gone back to bed, but Walter had spent long enough with this horse to know she didn't spook at nothing. Something was wrong, something she could feel through the ground that no human being could. He opened the stall. Clover bolted out into the storm, then stopped and turned back toward him, stamping, waiting. She wanted him to follow, so he did. That blind horse led her old master straight up the muddy hillside behind the farm, sure-footed in the pitch black, following senses he couldn't begin to understand. And when they reached the top of the ridge, Walter heard it, a deep, sickening crack echoing down the valley. The dam! It was failing. Walter didn't have a phone that worked up there. He didn't have time to drive down and warn folks door to door. The water would be on the town in minutes. But he had Clover. He climbed onto her bare back, an old man who hadn't ridden in years, on a blind horse in a thunderstorm, and he pointed her towards the lights of Maple Ridge, and he shouted, "Go, girl, go!" And she flew. Later, the people of that town would swear they'd never seen anything like it, a blind horse galloping full speed down a flooded road in the dark, an old farmer on his back ringing a cowbell and hollering at the top of his lungs, "Get up! Get out! The dam's breaking! Get to high ground!" Clover couldn't see a single thing, but she didn't need to. She could feel the road beneath her, smell the water coming, hear the terror in her master's voice, and she trusted him just as he had trusted her. House by house the lights came on. Families stumbled out into the rain, saw the old man and his horse, and ran for the hills. They made it. Every last one of them made it to high ground, just as the dam let go, and a wall of black water came roaring through the valley, sweeping away barns and fences and everything in its path. From the safety of the hillside, the whole town watched their homes flood, and every single one of them was alive to watch it because of a blind horse that everybody said was useless. When the sun finally rose the next morning over the drowned and muddy valley, the people of Maple Ridge came down off that hill and gathered around old Walter Boone and his mare. There were no jokes now, no laughter. The men who had mocked him at the auction that day stood there with tears running down their weathered faces. One of them, a big gruff fellow who'd been the loudest to laugh that day, walked up to Clover, laid his rough hand gently on her neck, and said in a broken voice, "I'm sorry, girl. I'm so sorry we ever doubted you." Walter just stood there in the mud, his arms wrapped around his horse's neck, his forehead pressed against hers, the way it had been from the very beginning. "That's all right," he said quietly, to the horse and to the town at once. "She never needed you to believe in her. She only needed one person to, and that was enough." They wanted to give Clover a medal. They wanted to put up a statue. In the end, the town did something better. They rebuilt Walter's barn first before any of their own, finer than it had ever been, with a big brass nameplate over the stall that read simply, "Clover, the horse who could see what we could not." Clover lived out the rest of her days in that barn, fat and happy and loved by an entire town, following the sound of a little bell wherever her old master walked. And every time some stranger passed through Maple Ridge and asked about the blind horse everyone treated like royalty, the folks there would smile and tell the story, and they'd always end it the very same way. Everybody thought Walter rescued that horse, but the truth is, she rescued all of us. Just goes to show, there's no such thing as a useless soul, only the ones we haven't given a chance to prove us wrong.